Next level. Next level.
Hello and welcome to CherrySTEM number 27, Scientific Interpretation, Spirituality. And we're going to be talking about holonomic brain theory and neoclassical interpretation of physics and how it all connects to consciousness and spirituality and all that good stuff. And this podcast is brought to you by listeners like yourself. Please visit patreon.com/AnnaCherry and check out the Challenger tier in particular if you'd like to hang out with us after the podcast and discuss relevant information that came up to you during the podcast or anything else you may want, as well as super secret patron exclusive content that is only available to patrons. Did I mention it's patron only? So check out patreon.com/AnnaCherry and help keep this podcast on the air and coming at you more frequently than once a month. So today we're talking to and / interviewing a little bit author of the paper Classical Interpretation Physics. So the patreon.com/7 Sage Secrets, where all of your 3 published papers are available, I believe, for free for public consumption.
Currently, I only have 2 that are in peer-reviewed. So the name of the paper is "The History of the Neoclassical Interpretation of Quantum Relativistic Physics," because what we want to talk about today is everything. We want the universe and everything.
As we know it.
Exactly. This is the 42 speech, I suppose. So there is. I will start at the beginning and start talking about that paper and kind of give an overview. Though the paper is pretty long and I don't want to just focus on it. But the what we're going to talk about is the intersection of physics with ideas of consciousness, the neurological correlates of consciousness, which basically that means is whenever you're starting to talk about consciousness, there's a variety of ways that there's a lot of language around. The idea is specifically, can we map what we see with the electricity moving around, the chemicals moving around, and the waves, etc., that are occurring, because there's also things like alpha, beta, gamma waves, etc. Can we map all of those to what we experience as consciousness? So, as a starting point, you do have to get to physics, and there are questions of, can we describe this in a kind of a mechanical fashion? Now, one of the first ways that people tend to try to describe this from a physics standpoint is to rely on the fuzziness and weirdness of mechanics. I take a completely different tack. I don't like. As a matter of fact, I've been spending a number of years pointing out that there are alternative interpretations that require no fuzzy magic anything, that are completely mechanical and completely well, the word that a lot of times that they use is, well, this is just counterintuitive. And in my mind, that is just the same excuse that you'll find in religion. Every time that you start to point out something rational, they'll start to say that God is beyond you, spirituality is beyond you, or they'll just try to talk you down by, who are you to question all these millions of people? And that's always the way that people hide the huge chunks of faith that they put into places where they don't have a mechanical. That's a necessity. Whenever you think about it, any one of us who is, when you look at a TV, you kind of know that there's if you know a little bit about electronics, etc., there's an infrared thing in your remote control, and there's some circuitry inside it, and it goes, and there's some circuitry inside the TV. But
do something about tubes, maybe.
Well, there's no,
like well, something
that's
in the
older.
TV.
That's actually older TVs.
Well, now it's like.
But the point is that so you have an idea that is, there's all of these huge things that you fill in with something that is basically faith. You don't know it yourself. You just have an abstraction and a faith that something in there works, and it works in a way that is rational. But whenever we start to talk about physics, there are there are a variety of ways in which you can describe things, the exact same things, and do it mathematically. And the way in which you describe what the math means can be very different. That's why we have, if people are familiar with the idea of having the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, and most recently people have been remembering pilot wave or de Broglie-Bohm theory. So, or it's also known as Bohmian mechanics. It's only just recently come back into the public consciousness field of physics because of the fact that we now have a set of macro level experiments that prove that we no longer need any kind of magical ideations around the way that particles interact.
The particle and the wave duality.
Right, the whole wave particle duality. There's a quote
well,
by
for some people, it may not even be clear as to why something particle and a wave. You know, so what is a wave?
Okay. Well, then unfortunately, I didn't want to go there because once you start to talk about waves, then you have to get to the point, you have to back all the way up to relativity. So
right. I mean, you take it wherever you want. Essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just flesh out this thing about different interpretations, because this is something that a lot of people are familiar with. Their idea that they know there's different interpretations of the same mathematical things, and so that idea, they can get their head around that the math doesn't change, but our idea of what the math represents, what the experiments represent, can be interpreted differently and mean very different things, and that is something that is very core to what I need to talk about, because most of the time, whenever people would start to talk about any difference, any question of relativity theory, the idea of there being an alternative interpretation of that is not something that's well known. That is not something that's known at all. It's part of history. That's part of what this paper is about. Is this alternative interpretation. But just like the mechanistic, rational version of quantum mechanics is only now coming to the surface because new experiments show us how these things work. The same thing can be true of this alternative and forgotten interpretation of relativistic physics. So you'll have to excuse us as we have to talk about the grounding of physics and how it's been used in the past, etc. Because there's a big gap between the way that consciousness is typically handled, and the way that people think of whenever you talk about consciousness and physics, and people kind of have a binary view about it. It's either, there's no need for any of that. That's just all a bunch of
it's kind of like the
crap.
soul thing. Is like, have scientists found what is a soul, but also the same for neuroscientists. That's been a question addressed to neuroscience and psychology. Have we scientifically found the seed of consciousness? Definitely a question.
And so I spend time in a group, like for instance, there's an individual who's the head of the National Science Foundation when they first introduced and he was responsible for the introduction of back propagation in networks. So, and that's really where neural networks finally started to take off and become something that was even useful at all. There was a period of time where people believed that neural couldn't work at all, and that was the orthodoxy in computer programming and in AI, is that neural networks could not work. There were books written about it, and now, of course, they're proven that they're the way that they work now, which is talking with a lot of other people who are so one of the other individuals who are in the idea of quantum mechanics and the idea of spirit or consciousness, etc., is Stuart Hameroff, and he's the name of that model that he's been working is sometimes they call it the Hameroff-Penrose model, because it's get Penrose's first name. I don't know why do that, but the two of them were working on two aspects of how to get from physics to consciousness. And so he is also in that group, and there's a variety of people who are talking um, about these topics and attempting to find some sort of consensus. And there are people who will try to insist that, oh, no, there's no need to explain anything additional. There's no need for quantum effects to explain consciousness. Well, then those are people who are extremely it absolutely does require additional mechanics to do certain tasks. So there's not quite. Here's the thing: a lot of people who use the current developments AI don't understand them, just like any programmer does. Whenever you are doing programming, you rely upon those things which were created at a much lower level, and you can spend, you write 1,000 lines of code and never touch anything that has to do with addressing the hardware, never touch anything that has to do with writing anything to the screen, because you rely upon other code to do that.
And I think other programmers definitely relate to that more than rich people in terms of how much
many
faith
layers, right? How many layers of faith that you have to have in prior tools.
As per earlier definition.
So that's the point: is that there are these requirements that you simply have faith in the tools and interpretations and understandings that happened before you, but that also means that sometimes those tools are developed in a way that nobody necessarily understands. In other words, part of how we started making neural networks is just by copying some of the things we noticed happening in the brain, and so there's a lot of ignorance about the mechanics of exactly what is happening in neural networks. There's in other words, even when you get down to the pedantic level of, okay, well, this causes this one little area to polarize in that way, even that isn't necessarily an understanding of exactly how the information is processed. Like, for instance, you can there's something called Babbage's difference engine, or where it's all made up of all of these gears, and it allows it to. It was one of the first mechanical computers ever made. You could go and you could understand exactly what a gear is. You could understand exactly how this gear maps to this gear, and you can see all of it happening right in front of you. There's nothing ambiguous about it. However, you may not still understand the wider picture of exactly how. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to neural networks. The level of not understanding how the calculation works, and it's related to holography. And so,
right, all these things are connected.
Yes, it's all connected, but we're talking about the nature of everything.
And it's the 42 show.
It is. It's the 42 show. So you'll have to excuse if we're going to be going to a lot of different fields. So back to. We have to start at the beginning. The neoclassical interpretation. Why did I put out this paper in the first place? If my goal is eventually to get to explaining how consciousness occurs in a mechanical way, as I said before. So the first problem you have is interpretation, and we're familiar. I've already covered that there are interpretations of quantum mechanics. Well, here's the thing that I think is very important to point out to people is that. Let me find this this quote from Feynman. It's this really great quote from. Hold on just a second here. I'm not going to be able to find it that quickly, so I'll just paraphrase and I'll find it here in a moment. But basically, Feynman was trying to explain, when he first started in one of his lectures in quantum mechanics, he was explaining that the dual slit experiment is something the effects that we are seeing happen in the dual slit experiment are absolutely impossible to explain in any kind of rational mechanical form that we would normally call classical. It's part of his lectures, and I'll drop a bunch of different quotes, etc., in the low bar or something. And that's simply not true anymore. When we started having something, it's Yves Coudet is one of the individuals who first started these experiments called Walker experiments or silicon oil drop experiments, where basically by creating a small plate that is constantly agitated, so it has it has general motion to it. You can then take a droplet of this. They used silicon oil, and if you drop the droplet on there, it will bounce indefinitely, never rejoining with the rest of the fluid. And the way that it explores the corral is a way to describe all of the different things that occur in quantum mechanics. In other words, it is the wave that it produces by bouncing against the surface then determines the way that it will be how its next bounce will what its outcome will be, and it's dependent upon such extraordinarily just huge numbers of variables. It's literally impossible unless you know, like, and where the location of every particle, everywhere is and what it's doing at a certain moment. You could not possibly predict the outcome of how this droplet is going to bounce. And that's called chaotic determinism. In other words, there is a very specific mechanic. There's nothing fuzzy. There's no such thing as random occurring here, but it looks random, and the only mathematics that is useful to describe the outcome is based on probability. But there is no probability underlying those mathematics. So therefore, if you confuse the mathematics and what it is that those mathematics represent, then you will have a bad picture of reality. The math is limited because our knowledge is limited. So that's what's really important here. So that's where pilot wave theory comes in, is that there is this idea of deterministic mechanics. So all of the magical ideas that you hear about in quantum mechanics, all of the spooky action at a distance, all of those things can actually be explained in a deterministic fashion. So in other words, there isn't the idea of random. Then, if pilot wave is the interpretation of quantum mechanics that is the superior one, the one that's the closer to match to reality.
And the reason it is, I would definitely recommend you check out the videos for yourself, but it essentially has one single particle, aka the drop, that explores the corral in a pattern that is just like the double slit experiment pattern of a wave.
Right. Well, the double slit is basically they have replicated the double slit experiment with these droplets as well. Yeah. And the particle, it's both a particle and a wave, and the droplet ends up going through one or the other based upon the chaotic determinism. In other words, there's tiny subtle effects that make it go through one slit or the other, and not both. But the wave that is guiding it, the wave that it created just before going through, travels through both slits, and therefore when it comes to the other side, because that wave is guiding the way that it will continue to move after that fact, though that wave that is part of the picture of determining where the particle will go, which was created by the particle bouncing on the surface, that will have an interference pattern that alters the likelihood of where the droplet will end up. And so you have all of these explanations for everything that seems like wave particle duality, and it can be explained in entirely. You can discard absolutely everything spooky, weird, or random in quantum mechanics and describe all of it with determinism. And so that's something that that's why it's rising to the fore again, because we no longer need to conceive of reality as this that it's random at the bottom level. And in fact, if you spent time programming, a lot of times you think you whenever you start really thinking about random number generators and trying to create a random number, you begin to realize there's no such thing as random, and it's one of those things that you realize it's just a shortcut for the human brain. Random isn't something that really exists in reality. So anyhow, so if pilot wave is, and it is, if you look close enough, if it is the one that matches reality better, so we get to do away with all of the magic, and we can explain those things in a different way. So that's one of the things that I'm talking about here, is explaining consciousness from a perspective of even determinism, chaotic determinism, but determinism nonetheless, purely mechanical, and not relying on any kind of outlandish or non-mechanical explanation. Anything that has kind of that fill in the the middle area with magic that we tend to do whenever we're explaining things that are very complex. So how is that done? Well, then furthermore, we have to back up. So you brought up the whole wave thing.
Yeah.
In 1905 is where we first allowed the magical things to start to happen in physics.
And not in a fun way.
And not in a fun way. And that is that there was already, before Einstein published in 1905 and was given primacy for special relativity, Poincaré was also working on the electrodynamical part. So special relativity is broken into two parts. First is the kinematics. So everything that you typically know about special relativity, which is time dilation, length contraction, and the appearance of light speed constancy, all of these things were created by someone else that he directly imported. There's no argument about that. There's no question about that. There's a lot of ignorance about that, but it directly came from Lorentz. Okay, so it's one step removed, and Einstein was relying upon that because what he was doing was then adding to that. So he starts off with the kinematical part, and then he goes on to the electrodynamical part. That is his contribution that is added upon Lorentz's kinematics that he explains at the beginning. So kinematics is basically the physics of motion, and whereas the electrodynamics, well, that's it's the electromagnetism within this system of looking at the world that came from Lorentz.
I was about to say, so you're saying that the theory of relativity isn't something completely new that came from Einstein?
Absolutely not. He came from a lot of prior art, and where even the electrodynamical part, it relies upon Maxwell's equations. So,
and can I just sour it even more with the fact that E equals mc squared is also just a shortened version of
Poincaré's work. Well, no, Poincaré would have gotten, he would have received primacy for the electrodynamical part as well, because he was also working with Lorentz. Einstein wasn't directly working with Lorentz until after the publication, even though he was using Lorentz's work. So there was just this small issue with Poincaré that attempting to publish a correction to his papers, and it didn't go through. Though he had sent in the correction before Einstein's publication, the correction didn't go through until after Einstein's publication. So chronologically, you can't really say. All we have is published dates, etc., when it comes to primacy for that aspect of relativity. So why do we talk about all that? Because Einstein's idea of how relativity works and how Poincaré and Lorentz's idea of how relativity works are two different interpretations. Both of them are relativistic. One, however, has the ether and the other does not. And so this is a point that you have to it takes a lot of discussion, and so I'm going to have to take a little bit of a shortcut here, but I just want to focus on the fact that it is two different interpretations. And where did all of the everything that came from, the idea of light speed constancy, where light seems to travel the same speed in all frames of reference, that came from Lorentz. And then of course the contraction and the time dilation. So all these things came from Lorentz, but his idea of a fourth dimension was he was simply using a math tool. Okay, dimensions are like it can be used as a way to have you got X, Y, Z,
axis,
right, and then T for time. Now, what he was using the fourth dimension for was to store faulty perspectives, because his intention was that he was modeling an illusion created by an object's motion through ether. Okay. Now, keep in mind, the exact same math describes both relativity theory and this theory in ether. And I kind of wanted to go off on a tangent, but I think I'm going to withhold
which
it for
ether is usually associated with Tesla and his awesome feats.
Yes. So
and
of
many
course,
other people like Maxwell, etc.
Well, yeah.
And
So the
Kelvin believed in-
Maxwell's equations were a description of inviscid fluid mechanics. It was a description of the way things moved in a fluid. That's how he created those equations that we are still using today, and all of the ideas that what Lorentz was what he was describing with the central calculation. Okay, so everything about relativity relies upon those very central calculations, which you hear as the Lorentz transform, but even more central than that is the change factor, the factor of change, how much something changes, where did that come from, why does it exist, what was the mental state, and
why is something changing, what is happening,
what is what is occurring, and what is
Why?
occurring is he was describing an object moving through a medium. And I guess I do need to kind of do a little bit here, because otherwise the whole rest of it kind of relies upon this understanding that there is a fluid dynamical description and interpretation of all that we have today. In other words, you don't have to change the math to have these subtleties where more information is available. So let me say right off the bat, more information is available in Lorentz's interpretation than is available in Einstein and Minkowski's interpretation, because and it is important to understand it is Einstein and Minkowski's interpretation, because it is only after Minkowski published in 1908 that we have the idea of space and time being conjoined. It's an absolutely for Einstein's idea of a fourth dimension, and the way that it wasn't even Einstein's idea of a fourth dimension. It was because all he was saying is that he first said the ether is not necessary, though it was, but he just said it wasn't necessary and went on from there. And that is, of course, odd, given that I got to stay away from basically saying that Einstein didn't understand it, even though I do have proof from some of his journals that he did not understand Lorentz's work, actually, and was still using it and then altering it without understanding the basis for it. But needless to say, there is an alternative interpretation. The math does not need to change for there to be a fluid mechanics available. So then the question that usually comes up then is what people kind of say is, well, if they're both the same, then and you've got a theory with the ether and without one, then you don't need the ether. It should fall to Occam's razor. Right. However, that's when people do not understand that if you remove the ether, you then have to have a real fourth dimension. Okay, that's a requirement. That's what Minkowski actually laid down in mathematical terms and showed, that you have to have a fourth dimension. So it's not ether or no ether. It's ether or a fourth dimension that is real. Now, like I said, Lorentz was using the fourth dimension as a handy notation tool for false perspectives of time. It was a way to understand how an illusion, that somebody who was under an illusion, and that illusion is semi-real. In other words, the contraction was real, the time dilation was real, but their perspective of time and their perspective of constancy was something that was illusory, and I can't get too much into that right now.
Don't you have videos on
Yes, I do have videos on that.
MMX, the Michelson-Morley experiment, and Lorentz's attempt at interpreting it, hence change factor.
Yeah, that's where he was describing what was happening, and I do have some lectures that get into this in more detail, and they're available on Steampunk Physics, the YouTube channel, right? So
just put that in your YouTube search bar after you're done listening.
Okay, so the point here is that it's not the whole Occam's razor thing that people argue is an absurdity, because the fourth dimension is adding infinite possible 3D realities within each single moment. In other words,
what's wrong with that?
Okay, in other words, when you add a real fourth dimension, instead of having these other perceptions of time that Lorentz was keeping up with, and that's what the fourth dimension meant in a preferred frame mechanics of ether. Instead, the Minkowski way of doing it is that there are infinite additional and what you might call incongruent. They can possibly be incongruent because of the fourth dimension allows the 3D reality to be different for each single moment of time. So in other words, a lot of times people think of fourth dimension time. Well, they already had that classical component. It's like, of course, if you want to keep up with a moment-to-moment picture of 3D reality, you have to have this picture of 3D reality, then this, then another, then another, then another. So that would be a fourth dimension if you wanted to hold multiple 3D realities, right? No, because that you have a unified. That is not a real fourth dimension. You have a unified picture of a 3D reality there, and you're not keeping up. You're not using the fourth dimension as Minkowski allows, and that is that within each single moment there are infinite possible 3D configurations of reality. That is the difference. So the question is, does Occam's razor remove a fluid medium that allows waves to propagate, or does it remove infinite additional 3D realities? Because that's the choice. And the truth of the matter is, any rational, look at this would say, well, of course, it's adding additional realities all stacked on top of each other that you would remove, not a fluid medium. Because in addition to that, you don't just remove the medium, you remove any kind of mechanics for wave propagation. Now we're at the whole.
This is the magic that you were talking about.
So this is the first point at which magic and irrationality and basically the end of the age of reason, the point at which we no longer need a reason for things to occur. That was the basis of science, is the age of reason. You had to have a chain of reasons why things occurred. The reason why waves occur, what's occurring in a wave, is that there is, just like if you were to step into a stadium packed full of people, they would have to kind of adjust, and then that adjustment that they made would propagate, because this guy would bump into that guy, then that guy would bump into that guy, and it would propagate, and it propagates in a wave. And we see waves in cars, in traffic, as they propagate along. But it is a group action. A wave is, like for instance in the air, it is a compression and rarefaction. It is this back and forth adjusting as they try to create a new equilibrium after a local change in density, pressure, etc. So saying a wave can exist without a medium waving is like saying a jog can exist without a jogger. It's nonsense, and it's an absurdity, and that is what you do, along with having to add infinite additional 3D realities on top of every single moment. You also have to completely remove any reason by which waves propagate if you remove the ether. So now, which way does Occam's razor cut? It's obvious. So once again, there is an ether. It's called that's why we're talking about the neoclassical interpretation of physics. The ether is the basis by which all of electromagnetism was developed. It was the behaviors of the ethers, and in my paper you'll find that this goes back to a fellow who's less well known, name of James McCullough, and his description of the ether through something called rotational elasticity, because elasticity, the development of elasticity, was a huge issue, such that Maxwell's equations were under question right just before the Michelson-Morley in 1887. Maxwell's equations were beginning to look ad hoc, and it was McCullough's work with rotational elasticity that actually saved Maxwell's equations from being viewed as something that was it would have been viewed as ad hoc, and therefore
talking about the equations that we're basing everything on now?
Yes, electromagnetism.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this rotational elasticity went through, and where you have Lord Kelvin developing, and like I said, I'm going to leave most of this in the paper, but to people reading the paper, I mean, and it goes into where Lord Kelvin spent, like him and who was the other? I always forget the other guy's name. That's terrible once again.
Mm-hmm.
He worked with another fellow on basically developing the everything in fluid mechanics, and then further in this paper I show how fluid mechanics, specifically in viscid fluid mechanics and fluid dynamics, they led to all of the various developments and tools we use in physics. And there's a quote, like for instance, from Einstein had a quote on Lord Kelvin's birthday about how he was the father of topology, and how he showed these things. So things like topology, things like knot theory,
And that's KN.
KNOT, yes, and
Not sure what the knots are.
Even
That's not sailor knots. It's something.
Like, there's something called the theory of spinors by Cartan that is very all of these things lead to things like general relativity. There are various tools that lead to general relativity and to quantum mechanics, and all of those things have crucial touch points at which they were entirely informed by developments in ether theory. They came from ether theory, and they're still compatible with ether theory.
Fluid mechanics.
Right. But, well, a special type of fluid mechanics that is now superfluid. It is what used to be called inviscid fluid dynamics or inviscid fluid mechanics is now the physics of superfluids. Because and at the time, of course, we didn't have anything. We didn't have superfluids way back in the time in the day. So talking about ether was talking about something that had very, very strange properties that were not intuitive. They were not something we had any example of in real life. We do now have an example of them in real life, and so it's just a lot like how we now understand how chaotic determinism works through Coudé's experiments, and John Bush at MIT has been doing lots of fantastic work in developing the Coudé experiments and the Walker experiments, and I really recommend absolutely everyone go to his website at MIT, and it's got just tons of information on how this stuff works and really, really great explanations. But so
speaking of a lot of realities all in one moment, that kind of made me think of the holonomic theory, which is connected to.
Yes, it is. So, point is, papers about how ether theory is completely compatible with today's physics, and understanding that is a difficulty because most people, if they know relativity theory, then they're going to be like, well, constancy is not compatible with preferred frame physics. And that's true. The illusion of constancy is, however, and the difference between it being an illusion and it being a reality is only testable in a two-way speed of light experiment, which has never successfully been done. Now, there's some subtleties around that I won't get into, but the part of the reason why it's not done is because of a belief system making it where they will automatically interpret it based upon a belief system, even if there are even if there is falsifying data that comes from the experiment, they will then interpret it as part of their belief system. So it's like for instance, there's this. I do have to kind of do a digression here about the various levels of truth that you can have. Now that's a lot of pedantics are going to be like, whoa, that's some bullshit right there.
There's only one truth.
Let me describe the levels of truth. Okay, so and you'll agree when I'm done. So there's a tribe in Papua New Guinea who has they go out and they do the ritual to honor the fishing tree, and they go out and they sing and beat a root into water, and fish rise to the surface, and they collect the fish, and that is how they prove in a semi-scientific fashion over and over and over that the spirit of the fishing tree responds to the ritual. Now, this really does occur. This is a true story. There are fish that respond. Well, here's the thing. So, from a Western mindset, there's no possible way this could work. And right now, you're like, well, is he saying it's a spirit? No, it's a neurotoxin. It's a neurotoxin that kills fish and it is safe for humans. So here's the thing. They have a way of conducting experiments, replicating the experiments. However, their belief system, the metaphysics, the ideas that they describe what's occurring, that the spirit is going and getting the fish for them or whatever.
I had an example just like that in my what was supposed to be anthropology class and was postmodernism. I'm still very upset about that. And high five to Prim that had the exact same experience in her college where it was complete bait and switch. But anyway, they were discussing how the tribe of whatever will
Believes in
pray
the spirit
to
of boiling.
spirit of water. Yeah, that it will like
Right.
pray to by
And
putting water in the
but
microwave.
here's the thing: they say that it's an equivalent truth, and it is not an
Right,
equivalent
this
truth,
was modern.
and that's because and so therefore
Levels
you
of
have
truth,
to.
you said.
There are levels of truth. In other words, there is a hierarchy to things that are in essence true, and some things are more true than others. So yes, there are multiple truths.
And what would be the rubric to
And the way that
gauge
you
what-
know that is by how well your model, your overall model, can predict with precision lots of not just things that you expect, but things that you do not expect. So, so it is the way that model unfolds as a mirror to reality that determines how close to truth it is. So for instance, since we know that it's a neurotoxin, we might then use it as a pain reliever because it's safe in humans, or as something for nerve pain, and you know there's other ways. But here's the thing: their model may be extensible as well. It just so happens that insects are vulnerable to things that are neurotoxins. So if they burned it near the bees, then in a certain way it could be gathering food for them, like it did before. It helps them, sedate or anesthetize the bees. And so once again, they could even extend their model, which is based on experimental evidence, and it has a type of truth to it. But exactly the granularity, the level at which they understand the causality is not quite right. And there is another understanding, the neurotoxin version, that is a little better and can narrow your search, because now at this point they think that they could go and burn it near some deer and maybe it'll fucking help them with the deer. It's not going to help with the deer. So there are ways in which our knowledge, by being more precise, can with the more precise mechanics and more information available, can unfold in a way that will allow our search pattern to be more narrow, and our understanding of reality will be more precise. So if we find another tree that has the exact same or another plant that has the exact same chemical structure in for a some sort of tannin it produces or something like that, then it too will almost certainly behave in the same way, and we can predict that. So there is a level of prediction. So that's why you can have a level of prediction, just like with the bees, that that is valuable based on a faulty model that is not entirely incorrect. And so the same thing can be true in hard sciences like physics, which is why we have alternative interpretations. So once again, going back to what all of this is about, what we're talking about is that there is an alternative interpretation with more information available that is based on fluid mechanics, that we have no experimental reason to prefer one versus the other, one interpretation over the other. In other words, there's never been a two-way speed of light test that has been considered to be
And didn't Dayton Miller's research invalidate a Nobel Prize?
Yes, it did.
Yes,
There's huge numbers of
definitely
reasons. I mean, I can go into the way that there was the round the
theory's
world
definitely not
Sagnac
perfect.
experiment where it shows a bias in one direction versus the other, and so that the Sagnac effect shouldn't even happen if special relativity was true when it comes to one-way versus two-way constancy. And the same thing is true with the atomic clocks and planes that people try to bring up. There are a variety of these things. It's a subtle here's the thing. It's a subtle dividing line, and people can't understand subtlety very well. They're either, it's like, oh, it has to be 100% this way and 100% that way. No, it's a hierarchy of truth here, and there's an alternative interpretation available that conforms, and it's the same math, but it's the way that you extend the math, the additional extensions and explorations that change. And so currently, that's why physics is in a model crisis. It's why we believe that 95% of the universe is made up of pixie dust.
Right.
There's reasons why, and all of these things go back to one singular point of failure, and that point of failure is believing constancy is real versus constancy is an illusion. And it's the difference between, and like I said, there's no experimental reason.
Right.
There's only the Occam's razor excuse. There's no experimental reason, which is convention. It's orthodoxy. It is not based upon experiment. So the point here was just to point out that there is a fluid dynamical approach to physics, and there are lots of experimenters. There are lots of individuals that are, and as a matter of fact, I think it's neoclassical.info or neoclassical physics, something that he actually used the same wording for it that I did independently, and his models of physics, which he's very deeply into general relativity. What is his name? Hold on. Good up, physics stuff. Maybe. Let's try that. Oh. Neoclassical. David something. Neoclassical physics. Not David Duchovny.
Not Mulder?
No, it's not him. I think this may be it. Neoclassical. Yeah, there he is. David Delphinit. And he actually interpreted. He interpreted from French to English the most advanced ether theory that actually led to Cartan's theory of spinors, and a variety of things that are, which now, by the way. Okay, so what I'm talking about now is called micropolar elasticity, and it's I won't get too much into it, but the point is it's a part of material science now that it was rediscovered back in the 50s, and is a huge advantage in computer modeling now as well. So they're finding all of these things where it's a far more accurate way to do things. It was based on it was a ether theory. Period. And it was based on this line of reasoning from Kelvin all the way back to the rotational elasticity from McCulloch. So there's this line of reasoning. It's all pointed out in that paper where it shows all of these ways in which fluid dynamical versions of physics and that interpretation completely interacts at every point, all the way from the deeply in the past all the way to the present day. And there are researchers at major institutions, like some of the people I've talked to is Ross Anderson and Robert Brady at Cambridge, who have a fluid dynamical description of particles that show all of the same spooky actions, except they're not spooky anymore. They're completely described in deterministic mechanics that work. So that's that. Yes.
And of course, a question from one of our patrons, or rather, a comment that you sound like you've had perhaps some difficulty with physicists in the past explaining some of these things due to your agitated tone.
Well, the thing is, when you deal with orthodoxy, here's the thing: very smart people are not aware of the orthodoxies they keep in mind. They can't see them. They're like hidden to them. They don't know what it is that they believe. They're not aware of the love. Every rational person has to have faith. If you're a rational person, you still have to rely on faith, and if you believe that you're not relying on faith, you are deluding yourself. None of us have completed every experiment ourselves. We believe in these structures that are useful and have been valuable in the past, whether it be academia or whatever. We have these things that we did not do every single experiment ourselves and could not
The
do every
faith that you were
experiment,
talking
and so
about.
you have to rely on faith, and so therefore things like orthodoxy can become invisible to you because it's just so many layers removed, and being able to see how these tiny little screw ups way back in the chain of knowledge that you are using every day could cause some sort of problem today is a very difficult thing to communicate to people, because it's a subtlety, and there's just this weight of, I do this every day. This thing works in these specific ways, and now it's just down to the details that the reason these things are mismatching, I just got to fix it right here. And it's kind of like anybody who's put together a very large object that has lots of moving parts that are not perfectly solid but are somewhat flexible a little bit, but it's a kind of stiff. You can just, every tiny little, thing that you're off, it becomes a cumulative error, and you can think that you can fix it, at the end where you're finally dealing with it no longer working. But the truth of the matter is sometimes you have to disassemble the whole damn thing and put it back together again. And that happens all the time. It happens in biology, for fuck's sake, but I won't get into that. The point is that there's these things way back that are just tiny little things being off that cause this cumulative error. And it's just very difficult to get people to see that they can't fix it right here. You can't fix it by another version of dark matter and energy. You can't fix it, with all of these absurdities.
The latest I saw, they were going to tweak the math until it's just right.
Yeah, that's what they're going to do.
It's like,
we're not in
really?
model crisis with every single thing that comes out everywhere showing us 1,000 different ways our model is breaking. No, that's not model crisis. We just got to, all I got to do is just push it really hard at this one point. And they don't want to reassemble everything from the beginning, of course. Who wants to? You spend your entire life in a subfield, and that's what. And anybody who's a programmer understands this. I mean, you may not even have the ability to rebuild the whole thing. I know I personally was programming, in C++. I was using Microsoft Foundation classes. Imagine being told that, well, you can no longer, you've got this project that you need to do, and it's not going to work with your skill set at all, and you're going to have to learn absolutely everything about all the way down to the hardware. That's an impossibility, and I know being told that I'm going to have to learn how to completely redesign the way that freaking computers work. Yeah, okay, maybe it's possible, but it's gonna. I can't. I sure as fuck can't do it alone. There are these types of things that are so daunting that you can't even grasp them. You can't even touch them, because that's part of what I'm trying to point out here. Is there is a path that is an alternative path that is showing a tremendous amount of promise, and there are people who at reputable establishments who are showing that this is the way to go, but nobody wants to go that way. Right. And it's kind of like redesigning Windows, the Windows operating system. It's practically, it's going to take huge numbers of people working together on something to be able to, go back to the beginning and redo all of it. And it wouldn't have to be completely redone. There's all of this information that we have. There are these analogies between things. And now, speaking of analogies, let's go back to quantum physics for a moment. In quantum physics, there's something called phonons. Okay, it's actually not in quantum physics, it's in material science, and it is whenever we are looking at I think one of the first uses for it is with laser technology. So whenever you're using lasers, you might be dealing with phonons, because it is a unit of energy. It is a discrete unit of energy in a crystalline lattice. So like some of the first lasers were done with rubies, and but the important thing to understand here is.
Are you saying crystals are magical?
Saying crystals are a basis for technology. Anyway, the thing with phonons is that they are a quantum mechanical treatment of mechanical waves. So phonons are particles, a lot like photons, but they have no actual real physical existence. Period. The mechanical waves that are propagating in a crystalline media, just basically like in ruby or whatever, there are transition energies. In other words, the amount of energy required for this, the distance between various particles can determine the frequency of the wave, and then the frequency of the wave when it's in partial amounts is going to have different effects, like the way it's going to bounce off certain places versus travel through certain areas. And that's going to be dependent upon frequency. So there's all these different things that have to do with transition, and so these transitions are they're very precise in a certain way. So photons, though we can think of them as particles, they don't exist, but they are a representation of something. Now, this is something you can look up yourself. There's nothing controversial about this at all. I'm simply describing something that we know and something we do, which is a quantum mechanical treatment of mechanical waves. And so that is that there is a substrate that we believe that these things are happening, then we're calling them particles as if they have their own discrete existence apart from the material, but they do not. It is the way that we are mathematically treating them. Just like there are not really actually gallons in a pool when we're talking about water, the gallons aren't there, they're a way of dividing it. But in this case, it's not such an arbitrary way of dividing it, it's a way of dividing it that takes into account properties of the medium. That's why it's so they seem so much more like particles, and it's so much more useful to treat them as these individual particles. But the particles do not exist at all. They're just a way of dividing waves, mechanical waves, compressions and rarefactions in the crystalline media. And so that is one of the ways in which you can see this this analogy, where we're using analogies, and we don't necessarily. Sometimes you can become so many layers abstracted through your analogies that the math no longer has much meaning to you. You can continue to use it as a tool, but you don't understand it. Once again, that goes back to the programming thing. There are some times in which you just use a function and you got no freaking clue what that function really does. You know what it does, but you don't really know what it's doing. And that's the truth of the matter. And that's where you have to have this layer of abstraction. You use the tools and you can advance forward. You can make lots of programs without having the faintest clue how to address the hardware. So the same thing is true in physics. They have these ways of applying things that are analogies. They are not. There's no physical existence to phonons. So understanding that is one of those crucial things that I have to get across to people so that they understand what we're talking about here, is that there are different ways to look at the current physics that we have. All of those discoveries, all of those all of that experimental data can mean something else, but you just have to map your idea of what's going on slightly differently. Right. Same math is occurring, but you can also use different math. And so back in, I think it was as early as the 1930s or 40s, that where they showed how quantum mechanics can be recast in hydrodynamic form. So it's not like this is something new. I'm not talking about something new. I'm not even talking about something that is particularly controversial in specifics. The overarching thing that I'm telling you about the possibility of there being an ether is something that is extremely controversial, because people do not understand that division between Lorenz's interpretation, Lorentz Poincaré interpretation, Poincaré, I'm never going to properly pronounce French names, and Einstein-Minkowski's interpretation, that there's a wide difference between the two, that we don't have experimental reason to prefer Einstein-Minkowski over Lorentz Poincaré, and that upon re-examination we have significant reason to do it the other way, and that extends not just from relativity but all the way into quantum mechanics. So now we've talked about all of this to lay the groundwork. So I'm sorry we had to do all that. We talked about it. We're going to talk about consciousness. How the hell? Well, I'll tell you how the hell. So now what I'm talking about is, how do we describe consciousness, which can be a very fuzzy subject because we don't understand a whole lot about it in some ways, and yet we do understand it very intimately in others. How do we describe consciousness in a way that doesn't rely on any appeal to magic, any appeal to concepts such as random, which I believe random does not exist. How do we do it without any of those appeals? Which I'm saying, so basically what I'm doing is I'm calling mainstream physics too wooish and magical, and which is what people have a hard time kind of grasping. That I'm literally saying mainstream physics is, what people, and mainstream physics isn't. There's two different things we need to separate: mainstream interpretations and then mainstream mathematics and experiments. And those things have a huge separation between them. Our narrative, our story, our idea of what's happening, just like there's something happening when that guy beats the root into the water, and he knows he can do it over and over, and he can then in the future apply it to the bees, or that those things are a kind of truth. But what's happening under the surface, he can measure the number of fish, and he can measure how much honey he gets, and all of it can come down to numbers, and it's going to be the same, but his story about it can be radically different from a story about the real evidence that will work better. And that's what we're talking about. So now let's go ahead and take a trip off to somewhat wooish land for a moment, and talk about where consciousness has been kind of dealt with and talked about, and what various viewpoints on it are. So here's the thing: there are people who will immediately, anytime you try to talk about consciousness in any way other than with just where you're so far abstracted from it, you're not talking about anything. You have the illusion of knowledge, and those people try to say that neural networks, we already got all the information we need. We don't need quantum mechanics to be involved in it at all. That is an ignorant perspective. They'll act like they're knowledgeable, but they're ignorant as shit. And they're way oversimplifying what is necessary to produce the level of computation that is occurring in a human brain. And then there's this level of complexity, and we've been grasping at it with tools that have magic built into them inherently. Right down to waves not having a medium, and spooky action at a distance that Einstein argued against. Which, by the way, that's one of the things I did want to point out, is that Einstein himself argued against the idea of constancy, and was talking about preferred frame physics and an ether in 1920. Okay, 1920. It's been nearly 100 years ago. Einstein was telling people that we do need some sort of idea of preferred frame physics. So there's a lot of things that come to us through the telephone game, and things that become orthodoxy can overwrite even where the originator himself had to say about what it is that our orthodoxy says about it. What were we going to say?
I was going to suggest ask rather, if there is any difference, if at all, between determinism as per that's why you would need essential ether, not just to have things that are waves, such as it's called a light wave. Therefore, something needs to be waving. Therefore, you need a medium, such as ether. But at the same time, is there a difference between fate and determinism, or is that one and the same, or how do we?
Okay, well, the idea of fate and determinism, that's kind of a subject that's a little difficult to get into, because our understanding of chaotic determinism is something that is fairly new. Whenever we think about fate, usually we put it in very simplistic terms. Like our minds can only grasp it in very oversimplified terms. It's just kind of a whenever you're talking about subjects like this, there are literally limitations to how well our minds work with lots of information simultaneously. We can if we divide it up a lot, we can kind of deal with it to a certain extent. But there are things like one of the best examples is whenever you think about what came first, the chicken or the egg. There is this idea where we're trying to make two things that are literally just one thing. We're arbitrarily dividing it, and it's kind of hard to think of the way that those things they're in a mutual dependency in a cycle that evolves over time.
Right, and we're opposing a harsh borderline and deciding border conditions, deciding which side we stand on, like,
right,
arbitrarily.
And so there's basically this goes back to something. The best book to read on this would be Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. And the idea is that there is kind of this vulnerability in mathematics where basically you can make mathematics turn in on itself, or any kind of logical, rational progression kind of break through something that is an infinite loop. Basically, it's the same way that computers tend to break. And you can do that through things like this sentence is false, which basically causes infinite regression. So this goes all the way back to, I think it was it Plato or Socrates? I don't know who. There's the problem of infinite regress. And that is, anytime we try to think about the cause of something, it not only continues going backwards infinitely, it also starts branching immediately, extremely, and it becomes an exponential branching as well. So right off the bat, as soon as you try to start thinking, well, this was caused because of this, because of this, because of this, you start automatically, because you can't think a lot about it. Like, I don't know if anybody's watched that How Things Were Made, or these connections. I think it's called Connections was the name of the show. There was a show where they said this happened and then this happened and this happened, and that's how we ended up in space. And that's cute, because the fact is what they did is accidentally prune all the branching of all the billions of other events that had to also happen to cause that linear chain that they can identify. So we can easily identify that linear chain.
Talk about the show that we've been watching? Or some
there's a really old one. I think there's a newer version of it where basically you say this happened because this happened because this happened, and you talk about this linear chain. But the thing is, and that seems really appealing to us, but it's not representative of reality in any way. It is a simplification that is simply one of billions of branches that are all converging on a single point that you identify, and you just simply follow one of the branches back, because our brains aren't really made to follow all of those simultaneous interconnections of all the billions of branches that come together. But the point is, we have ways of abstracting away from those, like the things that I'm talking about now. Even though I can't hold in my head all of the billions of branches of causality, that I can create these kinds of shortcuts in my head, and everybody can do that. But it's so we have these cognitive limitations that we can kind of conceive of the limitation itself without necessarily kind of overcoming it. So how did this come up?
Fate versus determinism.
Okay, fate versus determinism. So the same thing is true of the future. So if we think about all these instantaneously, there's tons of branching that has to happen anytime we think about a given event when we're going into the past. Well, the number of things that a single event also influences instantly begins branching like crazy as well. And so whenever we try to think of linear progressions into the future, we're not thinking of all the branches and the branches of branches of branches. And so there's the point here to talk about fate.
Very fractal.
There's whenever we in Gödel, Escher, and Bach, Gödel, God damn it. I'm going to continually mispronounce his name also. Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Hofstadter, he talks about that there are these types of algorithms that are non-terminating. In other words, they'll just keep going, and the only way, you can't take shortcuts to kind of guess what they'll be, because it has to be fully executed all the way to the end to determine what it will be. It requires
kind of like the answer 42. You have to build a computer that takes.
But the thing is it requires all of the things that are occurring to even determine it. So there's just no shortcutting it, and so there seems to kind of be a disconnect between our ideas of fate and actual determinism, and that's something that I can't really comment further on, because I feel like it is something that nobody really has a good grasp of. I think that we are all working with limited tools, and that there may be a fairly significant difference between determinism and fate. Because I think fate is an oversimplification.
Because we are watching anime right now that's focused fate.
Yeah, it is
talking about this concept.
Well, there is a crucial concept to understanding all of this, that something that happens is dependent upon its situation. An event is dependent upon. Okay, well, I've just talked about these ideas that we have are these linear chains of cause and effect. Right. However, at any given moment, we can look at all of the billions of other things that have to be in the right place. They have to be in the right place. That for you to be okay. So with the butterfly effect, you talk about that one linear chain of the butterfly leading to dust,
but why did that work?
Leading to a storm, and that leading to you having a car accident because of hydroplaning on water, and man plans to go to work, if it were like, for instance, if you're and God laughs. In other words, just that butterfly flapping its wing ends up. But whenever we think of that one linear chain, there's all the things that have to do with you being in the car, you being on that road, you being, all of those things have billions of other things contributing to that.
And so why did that happen? It was so many different confluences.
So there is sort of we think of causality in a very linear chain sort of fashion, and we don't think of the role that all of those instantaneous alignments play in causality. In other words, causal effects cannot be simply looked at from the past, what happened beforehand. That's a linear way of looking at it. You also have to look at causality from instantaneous configuration of reality at that moment. And so that's kind of a lateral component of causality. And so that's kind of an important concept here.
You say that's the fourth dimension?
I don't know.
Like time, because
well, yeah, I suppose.
They have to all sort of come together.
But the point here is that there is there's a dependency upon everything, and that there is a lot of times it's very difficult for human minds. We think of things in linear terms, and we don't think of things in that way, where there's just not. We kind of know it automatically. Everybody kind of knows that automatically, but you don't think about it enough to really put it in terms that are a little more focused upon that fact. It's something we kind of graze over and don't pay much attention to in any kind of conversations about it, etc. But it is very important to understanding holography.
Yep.
So we're going to talk about holography and how holography is not the image that is produced. It's not Princess Leia. No, it's not the image produced. It is a method of storing and combining information that allows it to overlap and then also be the individual components that are overlapping still be extracted. And it's done in a way that is very counterintuitive and most people don't really understand. And it is a principle that is very core to the way that consciousness works and to the way that and part of what's actually occurring in backpropagating, neural networks, etc. There is something. You mentioned
them earlier. Yes.
Right. There is a component to holography that is part of neural networks that people don't really necessarily associate. They don't associate neural networks with holography, but there is a way that they work that is very the way the two things are similar is very important to understand.
Now, is that also similar or different from Elon Musk and the other types talk about a theory that will live in a hologram?
I don't think so. The holographic universe theory is different in some ways and similar in others. Okay. So the idea of the holographic universe is that we may be inside a black hole and all of reality is basically two-dimensional, and that we only see a third dimension because it is a projected hologram from this surface on the inside of the black hole or something to that effect. It's just
Never mind.
It's a bit, yeah. It's there's a lot to it, and I may be slightly misrepresenting it as well
Right.
because I'm not all that interested in it.
Sure.
So based on some similar precepts, but it's I don't find it to be exactly the same. I think it's well, it's definitely not exactly the same as what I'm talking about. There is so going back to the holography thing, there is something called the Bohm and Pribram holonomic mind theory. So this is a theory of the way that the human brain stores and processes information,
Right.
and it tends to account for various things like why it is that you can take out a bunch of neurons and still not lose the individual memory. How does that work? Why is it that one memory and one neuron is there's not one bit to
Right.
one piece. There's not this one-to-one relationship, and it's because of holography. Now, when I say Bohm and Pribram, I mean the same David Bohm of the Bohmian mechanics that are part of the interpretation of quantum mechanics that I prefer and that I've been trying to tell everyone about. And that's what we're talking about here. Is there's a chain of things that are all connected here that I'm trying to point out, and that is the fluid dynamics that leads to a reason why Bohmian mechanics are proving to be better, and that's why this is, and how does this relate to consciousness? Okay. So now, as I said, we're gonna take a little trip into a little bit of the La La Land because I just ran into it just the other day. I find it highly entertaining because it turns out that this declassified document from the CIA, it was, when was it declassified?
2003.
2003. It's from 1983. Some of you may have heard about it before, and it is an attempt to using all of the physics and neuroscience that was known at the time, and this was in 1983, to as a basis for explaining remote viewing. So this is I think this may be the primary remote viewing document.
And remote viewing, of course, being the process of a psychic type of person who, as an asset to the CIA, will sit in a room or what have you, and psychically connect to another mind or
another place. Basically,
place.
get information about another place.
Right, and see what's going on over there.
So this was. So here's the thing, you got to ask how is it that a rational group of army men and the CIA is who manages its.
We're talking about the report was written by some general.
Yeah, the Department of the Army, U.S. Army Operational Group, Army Intelligence and Security Command, Fort George Meade, Maryland. So this is something I just ran into the other day, even though I already strongly was interested in the Bowman-Pribram model and part of the consciousness group that I interact with regularly. They basically the Pribram was a neuroscientist who then had kind of a protege named oh crap, I've forgotten his name. Yeah, that's terrible. Anyway, I'm really bad with names. Sorry about that. But he was in this consciousness group, until he died just fairly recently, I guess a year or two ago. And so I've been interested in the Bowman-Pribram model because it's the only one that makes any sense, and for a long time. And then this was just a week or two ago that I ran into this document about remote viewing released by the CIA. So what they're trying to do in this document is come up with a rational set of reasoning for what seems to be psychic phenomena or whatever. So I found it very interesting. And what was neat is that because they also are referring to what was one of the best models at the time and it still is, for how the brain produces consciousness and stores and processes information would be the Bowman-Pribram model. They mention the Bowman-Pribram model, and then also give one of the most one of the clearest descriptions of what holography actually is that I've ever run into, and it's clear, concise, and I find that even professionals in a variety of fields don't understand holography well enough to explain it in a way that is concise. And so running into it in this paper was very interesting. Mm-hmm. So I want to find the point at which he is describing a holography, and we're going to read that to you. And actually, you're going to read it to give my voice a little bit of a break here. Sure. So they're going on about all of these different processes. Let's see, frequency following response.
Now, is remote viewing and clairvoyance same or different?
I think it would be fairly similar. Yeah, I don't know. There might be some, who knows, some subtle difference. Here we go. Holograms. All right. Now, so the context of this is there's a lot of other stuff that, of course, we'll leave a link to a link to the CIA so they can know that you're looking at this document too.
Yep, it's right there.
Exactly. We'll leave a link to the declassified thing so you can read through it if you like. But here, yeah, go ahead and read this.
And this is, I believe, on page 7 of this document, perhaps.
It's called the gateway process, is what this was about. So. Mm-hmm.
And the it's on page 9 of the PDF here, and it's point number 12. Holograms. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projecting or expanding at certain frequencies in a three-dimensional mode that creates a living pattern called a hologram. The concept of the hologram can be most easily understood by using an example cited by Bentov, in which he asks the reader to visualize a bowl full of water, into which 3 pebbles are dropped. As the ripple created by the simultaneous entry of the 3 pebbles radiates outward towards the rim of the bowl, Bentov further asks the reader to visualize that the surface of the water is suddenly flash frozen, so that the ripple pattern is preserved instantly. The ice is removed, leaving the 3 pebbles still laying at the bottom of the bowl. Then the ice is exposed to a powerful, coherent source of light, such as a laser. The result will be a 3-dimensional model or representation of the position of the 3 pebbles suspended in midair. Holograms are capable of encoding so much detail that, for example, it is possible to take a holographic projection of a glass of swamp water and view it under magnification to see small organisms not visible to the naked eye when the glass of water itself is examined. The whole concept of the holography, despite its scientific implications, has only been known to the physicists since the underlying mathematical principles were worked out by Denis Gabor in 1947. He later won a Nobel Prize for his work. Laboratory demonstration of Gabor's work only occurred years later following invention of the laser. As biologist Lyle Watson explains, quote, "The purest kind of light available to us produced by a laser, which sends out a beam in which all the waves are of one frequency, like those made by an ideal pebble in a perfect pond. When 2 laser beams touch, they produce an interference pattern of light and dark ripples that can be recorded on a photographic plate. And if one of the beams, instead of coming directly from the laser, is reflected first off an object such as a human face, the resulting pattern will be very complex indeed, but it can still be recorded. The record will be a hologram of the face." 13. The part encodes the whole. Of further importance is the fact that even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection, but the fact remains that a whole projection would nonetheless be made. The key to creating any hologram is that energy in motion must interact with energy in a state of rest, not motion. In the foregoing example, the pebble represents energy in motion, while the water, before its agitation by the pebble, represents energy at a state of rest. To activate or in effect to perceive the meaning of a holograph, energy In this case, a coherent light source interaction between the moving energy. Hold on. In this case, a coherent light source, such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by the interaction between the moving energy and their energy at rest. And the simple interaction between the moving energy and the energy. Oh my God, I can't do this. Jesus.
Would you like for me to take over?
No, it's all starting to blur together because it's like this old-fashioned typewriter font on white paper. And
Okay, so let's get a running.
sorry, to activate or in effect to perceive, in quotes, the meaning of a holograph, energy, in this case a coherent light source such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by the interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentov, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project a three-dimensional holographic image, its quote, meaning, into space. As Marilyn Ferguson, editor of the Brain Mind Bulletin, tells us, quote, another feature of a hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic photograph is stored everywhere on the plate.
Okay, that's it. That's
So
a
what
good
does it
ending point. So
What does that all mean?
what does that all mean? So that's a description of how holograms work. Now, actually, there's an article on how stuff works. I think is that where it is? How stuff works. Holograms. I think if this is what I'm thinking, it is also a very good description with yes how holograms work on how stuff works. That website is it shows a picture of a hologram being split in a hologram of a star being split in two and showing two holograms of stars and those being pieces, and then you see more holograms of stars. So that's the article, and that will be that's also a very good guide to understanding how holograms work, and it's a very important concept to understand anything that I'm going to try to tell you about consciousness. But so I'm going to try to go on about it a little bit more, and that's just another resource for explaining it in other terms that might be useful to you. But the important part to understand here is that the whole image is encoded on every part of it. So you say you got a piece of paper, and the only thing that you're seeing is a three-dimensional star, on that piece of paper. When you cut that piece of paper in half, there is still, even though you went right down the middle of the star, if you look at it with the right angle, those two halves will each have a star on them. A whole star, not the half a star. That's difficult to understand how that could even work, right? And it's because of the way that information is encoded everywhere. It's combined. It's information on top of other information, all compressed together.
What did lasers have to do with it?
It has to do with making something that's very, very precise, and not because any light that you look at normally is made up of multiple frequencies, and of course, unless it's the purest tone, even if it's made up of white light, you're still going to have lots of different phases that are varying, etc. So there's just it's a hyper simplification of it that allows you to basically pick out one set of information from all of the information. That combined with the angle of incidence. So, okay, I was explaining that to her, but let me back up in just a moment. So it's important to understand that what we're talking about is that information for a single thing, a single image, the whole thing is at every given point on the holographic plate or surface, all the information for the star. So how on earth could all of the information for the star be in every single place?
Right.
And the way that works is going to be difficult to describe, but I really got to hammer this home that it's not like the pixels that you see on a typical image, where at one point you see a pixel. And so I'm going to use one of the holograms that a lot of people are probably familiar with, and that is the Visa hologram. There used to be a dove on it. And if we think of that dove as a typical image on a piece of paper, and not a hologram, then there is a point at which the tip of its beak is made up of, like, let's say it's like 3 pixels, but let's just pick one particular pixel at the very tip of the beak, and it's just 1 pixel. The only information there is the color of whatever we want it to be right there, right? That's all that is there, just a given color. That is not true of a hologram. And not only is the beak not the tip of the beak not at that one location, it's in a variety of locations.
Well, what does that mean?
It's spread out across the hologram.
Oh.
And how it does that is because what you are not viewing when you zoom in on it. What is there? Light coming from all of the different places on the holographic. I'm gonna keep calling it a plate because that was some of the early holograms were done on plates. All of the light reflecting off of that plate from every different angle on that plate is all coming to a single point on your eye. And it has the ability to interfere. So the information from one point and another is actually pairing off and removing information coming from other points. There's interactions and amplifying information coming from others. So you have to understand the principle of interference, how interference works. Now, not just the word interference like you typically hear, but specifically waves interacting. When waves interact,
waves of light in this case.
Yeah, waves of light in this case. When a peak interacts with another peak or a trough interacts with another trough, they are amplified. So basically, if we think of this in terms of like sound, the more compressed or rarefied an area is, if you have a compression added to a compression, it's double the compression. If there's a rarefaction added to another rarefaction, it's double the rarefaction. So it completely makes sense in a mechanical sort of way, but there are more complex ways that waves travel than that kind of the way that we think of sound. There's more complex ways that it travels through solids and through the ether. But needless to say, the interactions that occur can add or subtract. And so what's happening is when you get an image, when you're looking at a hologram, what you are seeing is the combination of not just the light that you're, like you would say you're looking at the tip of the beak. Well, the light coming from a place just to the right, to the top, to the left, all of those things are adding some information to the thing coming from that place that you think of as the tip of the beak, and subtracting other information. So it's these additions and subtractions of the information coming from the areas around it. And in fact, the light coming from the corner of the page, way the hell away from that tip of the beak that you're staring at, is also adding and subtracting information from the light that is coming from the point that you think of as the tip of the beak.
It seems so complex. How is that made to interfere with each other? Like
because
that?
We do it by using light. We allow light to do it. It's just like the way the Michelson-Morley experiment happened. The way the Michelson-Morley experiment was something that you would, once you started to just barely begin to understand it, you would think it would be impossible with the technology of the day, but it wasn't, because what we were doing was using light on itself. Right. And so light has the ability to do these things. Well, sound has the ability to do it as well, and I actually plan on doing stuff with sound holograms, but that's another discussion. Anyway, the point is that the information coming from all of those points is coming to a point at the eye. So one of the things to think about is that we experience something sort of like this in our everyday lives, and that is when you're in the center of a room. Let's think of freezing the light, and when you're like in the center of the room. And now think about this for a moment. Since you can view the whole room from any given point in the room, then that means now that I've frozen the light in the room, the whole image of the room is existing at every point in the room.
Not sure.
Okay, so you can say you're standing in the center of the room, and you move to the upper left of the room. You still see the whole room. And you move to the lower right, you still see the whole room. That's because light is bouncing off of every surface and going in every direction and reaching every point. So
Right.
every object that you could possibly see is shining light in that direction.
Right.
And so you have this combination of all the information.
So let's say if you were to trace every single, so like you have frozen your room right around you, right? So let's think of the corner of the door
Mhm.
and trace the a laser beam from
Mhm.
your eyeball to that corner while you're standing in the center. Then let's have you move wherever and then still see the corner and trace a laser there. And you can move around, and in that sense, that corner of the room
Is shining little lasers
in every single
to every single point in the room.
Okay.
That corner of the room
So
is shining.
if you were to interpose or overlay a mesh of lasers from
that point,
by using
anything that you see,
yeah,
that laser is going to
Okay.
point to every single other point in the room.
is gonna
And then pick another point, and it does the same thing. And so
therefore it exists in every
right.
point.
So that's
Okay.
why the whole image of the room exists at
In
every
every point in the room. Okay.
in the room,
That
even
makes
once
sense.
you've frozen all the light. So understanding that that our eyes have to. That's why we have to focus. That's why your eyes have to do the focus thing. Is because when an image is not in focus, you're getting information from other areas. You haven't pruned off the information that is duplicated. There's lots of duplicated information, and so there's this addition and subtraction of information that's kind of happening there, and that's why our eyes have to focus, is because of all those various angles at which light can be entering the eye.
Are they Merkles?
Circles?
I
What?
said angles.
Angles. Oh. So that is kind of it's not exactly holography, but it is similar in principle of understanding that there are large sets of information, because the same sort of thing happens with a hologram, that if we keep reducing, like say for instance you capture an image of a star, on one single holographic plate, then and you chip off a little tiny piece. Like say the piece is the original plate is the size of a typical like 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and then you take off a little piece that's the size of a dime. There's still going to be the image of the star, even though it was a huge star on that plate initially. Then you rip off your little dime-sized piece, and there's a tiny star there. That tiny star doesn't have as much what's it called, refining information. It doesn't have the information that will properly refine it, so it may be extremely blurry, and
that's hard to understand. Why?
because there's more resolution available. There's more points of tiny like exactly all the cross references coming from all over that huge sheet. Each one of them adds up to another subtle little fucking tiny alteration to the image that refines it more and more and more. So basically, as you reduce all the various angles and all the information that's on that sheet down to make your little dime-sized piece, there's no longer as much information available to refine the image that you're looking at. So even though the image is still there, it's not as well defined. And so this should sound similar to how memories can sometimes be fuzzier.
Right.
And so there is that. Now you should be able to see how this also relates to the idea of individual neurons not relating one-to-one with memories, but instead being able to encode information that, when it is all together as a whole, and so this is called a holistic approach, which is why it's called a hologram. It's the whole thing adding together creates the individual event. And so the individual thing would be, any given memory is created through the interaction of the whole brain. In other words, and so this.
It's not spelled WH.
No, it's not spelled WH, but that is actually where it comes from. The idea of a hologram is because of it being a whole. It's the spelling is just different.
Weird.
Well, any kind of whenever they're talking about holistic approaches, it's because they spell it with it just an H, but it's supposed to be the whole thing.
So it's when you say holonomic brain theory, that has nothing to do with holograms, like the little layers, but it has everything to do with holograms.
No, yes, exactly.
So power crystals, we're back.
Oh yeah, you know what's funny is that CIA paper. It's actually part of a group of papers released that are called the Stargate group of
Cute.
papers. Yes, it is cute. But anyway, and why that matters is because in Stargate they have the crystals as part of their technology. That's
The little
yeah, right.
home devices.
Funny. Well, I think it was the Goa'uld had their shit was powered by crystals somehow. Anyway, okay. So now we've talked about holograms. We've talked about
briefly touched on consciousness. How that is, because I mean it is connected physics through Bohm, like
yes,
directly.
in physics. Yeah, Bohm has you have the de Broglie-Bohm pilot wave interpretation of quantum mechanics, and then you have the Bohm-Pribram holonomic brain theory, and the reason is because obviously Bohm was a badass and he understood both of these things. So,
did we want to talk about holonomic brain theory as it relates to
holography? Well, I kind of did touch on it just a little bit there because and that's what I was going to continue forward.
Right.
So when we talk about some of the things that have to do with consciousness that have been proven time and time again to be related to states of consciousness is the various waveforms that are occurring in the brain. Now, I mean, there are systems that can use the various sets of waves that whether it's alpha, beta, gamma, theta waves, and so that's the frequency of the waves that are occurring in the brain, and they use those in a kind of a general way to find out things like certain states of mind, and so these are well-known things that the brain tends to synchronize large-scale waves of action occurring. So you should be able to understand that what I'm saying here is that these large-scale synchronizations of the firings of neurons are part of the lateral causation. Remember, I was talking about how all the things that are happening beside something that create a situation are part of it that we have to think about in causality. Well, the same thing would be true here in the holonomic brain theory. The firing of a given neuron, that's called an action potential, is altered by the firing of neurons that are sort of beside it, we'll say, if we think of it as like a single slice through the brain. All those ones that are giving off electromagnetic information, because whenever electromagnetic waves, whenever electricity travels through a wire, there is a wave that is, so you have electricity going one way, and you have a magnetism in the other direction. And so this is kind of the principle, the basic principles of electromagnetism, that whenever a neuron has electricity firing through it, there's magnetic, I would assume to call them waves, but it's kind of confusing. But there are these patterns of waves that are occurring in the brain that are synchronizations that are that create patterns that are like the three stones being dropped in the bowl of water that he was describing when he was describing holograms. It is information that is coming together. It's electromagnetic information, and there are peaks and troughs that kind of impinge on the sides, or coming in from the sides, that they gather together into points that change the likelihood that a given neuron will fire. So action potential can actually be changed by the way that all of the neurons in the brain are firing. And furthermore,
we're talking about waves.
Yes, and we're talking about waves still. So, and furthermore, not only that, there is a mechanism by which those waves are recorded in a short-term way in the astroglia. So the astroglia are the glia are various types of cells that support
Specifically
neurons.
brain cells.
Types of brain cells that support neurons. A lot of times they are responsible for myelination, which is the sheath around the neurons. Well, astroglia are they have something where there's these large groups of them, and they are connected by something called gap junctions. And what these gap junctions do is they are a slow method of allowing ions between the various cells that make it where they can actually store a charge in them that is only slowly changed. It's not instantly changed, it's very slowly. So multiple repeated repetitions of a given strength of a field would actually be written into the astroglia and would not go away, but kind of stay there for a short period of time because of the way that gap junctions work. And then this turns into that the way that dendrites actually form is by following the charges that are stored in astroglia. So what this means is, what I'm talking about is
So would it be fair to say that the more frequently something fires, the stronger would be the charge in a particular area? So it's like it's recording gradients,
but it
or
would
is
be
it
yes, is recording. But it's not only that; it's recording a specific pattern of the interaction of all of the waves that are coming from various parts of the brain and impinging on that particular point. And then after the fact, dendrites grow into that place where there was an amplified
repeated activation. So would it be fair to say
it physically encodes the interference pattern that occurred from large scale synchronized activations of in the way that that neurons were simultaneously firing, and so it is storing it. And so yes,
simultaneously and repeatedly. Therefore, it's sort of recording.
It's an aggregate.
It's wearing a path of what is happening into,
like a river, yes,
into the area. But also at the same time, the more something is repeated, the more likely it seems like dendrites would to grow that. So it's sort of like cementing what you're looping frequently.
Right, which in neuroscience is how long-term potentiation occurs and a variety of other things. So there is a here's the thing. Understanding that fields are part of the way that the structure of dendrites what mediates the structure of dendrites, what mediates the way that synapses are formed and where they are formed and how that equates to information is all explained through this model, but it is not yet explained in typical neuroscience, though they are reticent to adopt this model, which doesn't really make any sense given that it also, once you start to understand the way that neural networks work, you see this holographic principle occurring in neural networks as well, and it should be able to. There's no reason why they shouldn't be adopting it more, but they just simply aren't. I guess it's just a lack of understanding. But anyway, so we can take this model and say, all right, then why does the physics theory matter? The physics theory matters because of understanding that there is this central mechanic of the way that everything in the universe tends to work, and seeing that there are these centralized mechanics that are in agreement with each other is part of how we see that that something that we don't necessarily have all the information about is a good and valuable place to start mining for information, because that's what this is really about. This is not about saying that this is the one true way to go. This is about saying, hey, here is a valuable area for investigation. That's what science is about. It's not about saying that this is absolutely true. It's about taking our search down from being an infinite search to narrowing the field in the direction that we should be looking to find proof. And so that's what I'm talking about, is that there is a set of views that all work together in a very mechanical fashion that that support each other because they all work and in a mechanical fashion and provide more information and give a better explanation and do not rely upon magic.
So provide more information than the current theory.
Correct.
Because I'm sorry, but CERN isn't sending us to the moon again, or to colonize space, or to get us hoverboards. So come on, physics, like step it up. You've been in a funk for 50 years, not really progressing anywhere.
100.
Like the rockets we have are still from like the 50s. There's been a lot of like not
well, the thing is, you can
not
always,
the future we were promised, but it's almost 2020. People, where's our fucking futuristic hover cars and shit? Physics is straying behind compared to biology and neuroscience, where we're on the verge of building AI, on the verge of cyberizing humans. Like it's leaps and bounds.
It's
in
progressing
other,
so much faster.
right,
Biology is because
right.
biology doesn't have any magic in it.
That's what I'm saying. Like, come on, physics, catch up.
Right. They don't have any magical beliefs. They the only magical beliefs they have are the electron transport train. They have to rely upon physics. But anyway, so the oh, and by the way, there's a lot more information about how ether theory works. There's even like Rutherford's mentor, the Rutherford model of the atom. You're probably familiar with, and you're probably familiar with Rutherford when it comes to atomic physics in general. His mentor, J.J. Thomson, had a mechanical explanation of valence, which we do not currently have any kind of mechanical. It just does. It just is. We don't know why. But we did know why when J.J. Thomson created a ring vortex model of how valence worked mechanically based on ether physics, which is present and and is responsible for all of our mathematical tools that we have today in physics. So now we've gotten to the point where we've got a model of let's presume for a moment that this model of physics and this model of the way that the brain works is accurate. Furthermore, one of the other things that is important is that like Stuart Hameroff is the guy who Hameroff and Penrose are probably the most well-known quantum physics model of consciousness, and he gets into he's very fascinated with the way that microtubules work. So microtubules are.
I'll see if I can find that microtubule Walker video. It's
yes, right. So they provide a structure for cells, and they play a lot of interesting roles. And they're this interesting self-assembling structure. And whenever you start looking at the way that cellular mechanics works, it's basically all these different little magnets that are the right shape to make everything happen on its own. In other words, they end up being little magnet machines. And understanding cellular mechanics at a finite level is kind of important to see how there is not any kind of magic down there. But yeah, down at that level, there's no magic. It's all just like little configurations, complex configurations of magnetic fields. So anyway. So microtubules in the Hameroff-Penrose model, Hameroff is providing some of the neuroscience part of it, whereas Penrose was giving he has this, I think it's orchestrated objective reduction, OR is what it's called, and it's this idea. It's a many worlds. It's the using many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics as a way to say that consciousness is part of defining reality, and I would disagree with any model that specifically puts it in those terms. However, I think that there is some truth to what they're saying in that it's like a selector, just like a laser, and the angle of incidence shows you a specific image on a holographic plate. The same would sort of be true with whenever we're dealing with particles at the quantum level. But going back to the idea of the Hameroff model and how it works is with microtubules. And so microtubules, they play a role in, for instance, if you've ever watched chromosomes be pulled apart, in their neat little dance of how the chromosomes get pulled apart during mitosis and meiosis. they are crucial in that process, and why they're crucial in that process is because they are like little magnetic threads, and that's important to understand. Is that they're like magnetic wires, and so they attach to things because they are polarized in that way. And they do play a role very specifically when I was talking about how dendrites, the shape of the dendrites are determined by the charges in the astroglia. The way that they follow the charge is by the microtubules. So the microtubule organization, the poles that are actually basically magnetic fields in these microtubules are how it follows these paths, and how it, what it's the structure that makes this physically happen. So I believe that there is, that Hameroff is kind of going in the right direction. And so there are once again, we have to look at the way that these various models that are all kind of analogies of each other. There are these various analogies that we're attempting to describe the same phenomena in different ways, and that is once again a very important principle to understand here. Is there are analogies that are basically the story of what's happening, and then there are the actual recordings of physical phenomena. It's the recordings are not very questionable since we have a lot of data, but our understanding of what the recording means is very questionable. So, taking that a bit further, let's think about if space is made of something that is a superfluid. And so we're just kind of presuming that this model is correct for a moment. And if it's a superfluid, then one of the things that occurs in superfluids is these filaments. Mm-hmm. So they're called vortex filaments, and they spontaneously arise.
Isn't that another paper?
Yes. I'm actually referring to my oldest paper.
That one as well.
And my oldest paper actually pulls all of these things together in one paper, whereas my most recent papers, I realized I was giving them too much information at once. And so I needed to pare it down to the most important thing, which was to make sure that people understood the interchangeability of the fluid dynamical model of quantum and relativistic physics with our current model. So, going back to, what was I saying?
The filaments that arise in super.
So in superfluids, so the very best model of whenever we look at the various models of like general relativity, it's based upon rotations in space. There are these there's a lot of to put it very generally, it's about rotations, fine rotations in space, and whatever you're getting into extending general relativity or looking at the way general relativity works, it's we're really talking about the best way I could put it is rotations in space. So let's just kind of stay at that, because anything further is just going to get too far afield. Mm-hmm. The thing is, one of the things that we know about superfluids is that they conform to what is inviscid fluid dynamics or mechanics, that was what electromagnetism was based on by Maxwell, and all of the behaviors of superfluids tend to match electromagnetism in the ways that are important. So that would mean that space has a structure, and that throughout space would be what would be almost undetectable filaments that are rotational structures, these vortex filaments. And of course, if this medium was in any way churning, moving, etc., it would interact with particles and cause Brownian motion. So there's multiple reasons to believe that if this model is correct, then the whole zoo of particles that we have are abstractions. They are abstractions to fluid dynamics, that we're basically taking all of these different types of movement and rotation and things that are occurring in this substrate, which by the way, in some of the theories, in some quantum theories, they basically say that particles pop in and out of existence in space. That's their idea. Is that they just literally they're popping.
What?
Yes.
Why?
Where the
Talk about Occam's razor. Why is that? Not?
I know. That is part of quantum mechanics. Is that there these or quantum field theory. I think is it's kind of difficult to divide between them, but the particles are popping in and out of existence. And I mean, they call them virtual particles for a reason, because the whole idea of particles popping in and out of existence is absurd by itself. But why they call one, any description of why any of these things are happening is just left for
Because
So if this is occurring, what's interesting is that what we would have is a structure to space, and whenever you look at a magnetic field, one of the things that occurs that a lot of people are not aware of is you can take a heel-shaw plate, which is basically what you do is you take two pieces of glass, stick some ferrofluid between them, and what you can then do is light it from the side, and if you bring a magnet close to this, you will see a structure pop up. So what is this structure representative of? Why is it occurring? I mean, just when you look at a ferrofluid brought in proximity with a magnetic
some
field,
majestic stuff.
a structure appears. So the idea of the lines of force that came all the way from Faraday through Maxwell then correspond to these vortex filaments, and then the organization and capture of vortex filaments occurring because of the way that materials are arranged would be why we have these persistent magnetic fields, because they're made up of this structure. So anyhow, the whole point is, if something has structure, it can store data. So it opens up a huge area of speculation for looking at, or speculation and investigation when it comes to what information can be stored in a medium that is basically a superfluid, and that is made up of vortex filaments, which are interacting with everything that is electromagnetic, which in this model, everything would be electromagnetism in one form or another. Now, I mean, I'm really leaving a whole lot to the imagination here at this point, because there's this could go on and on. I'd be talking for days if I continued to tell you more about the book that I'm writing. But this is a very good primer to what is in the book, and specifically, why it is that I'm writing it. So one thing why I was bringing this up on the heels of talking about microtubules is because microtubules may in fact be like one of the things that happens in when you have superconductors is something called flux pinning. And so what we think of as flux may actually correspond with what was called Faraday's lines of force, and what I'm calling vortex filaments, which we see in a superfluid. And so it is pinning these things and holding them in a single place, and that may be what is occurring in anything that is electromagnetic in nature, and it may be what is occurring in cells that have these organized microtubules. In which case, then we have, just like we're beginning to understand that our biology extends to all of the bacteria, and there's kind of a smooth continuum between us and the various in our microbiome, because we find things like you can change a person's attitudes and their dominance behaviors, their personality, their everything by simply changing their microbiome significantly. And so the line between us and our microbiome is becoming more and more blurred, whereas we thought
especially with poop transplant experiments.
Yeah, There's a lot.
No,
So
there's a lot going
so
on
the
there.
truth is the line between our thoughts and the electromagnetism, the electromagnetic environment around us
Well,
may in fact be a little more blurred than we think. In other words,
Isn't-
there's still sort of a yes.
Isn't the Schumann resonance something that theoretically humans need to like not go insane? It's like there's a variety of interactions.
That's the when you're in
frequencies.
when you're in the area of speculation. Yes, there's a lot of ideas of entrainment of certain brainwave frequencies, and our brainwaves seem to be centered around the Schumann resonance, which is
Earth's
right. So there's a lot of speculation, but not we're getting way into speculation territory.
Fun.
And that's really all you can do is once you get to a point at which you're trying to identify something that is worthy of investigation, then what you do is you speculate and then you say, okay, but we have to investigate that. We have to find hard data. We have to
Right.
find evidence. But the point here that is interesting that I like when we're talking about speculation is that what I have now described to you is a method by which all of the information which is stored in a human brain extends out to a field which can then continue to store that information. The interaction of your brain with the electromagnetic field could organize the structure of the what are they called, the vortex filaments, and that this structure then, if it is flowing around the Earth along with the magnetosphere, which there's indication that it is based on the Dayton Miller's tens of thousands of positive experiments that detected the ether, and he won a prize from the AAAS, the American Academy for Advancement of Science, for proving that there was an ether, and that's something you've never heard of because it's kind of been suppressed. Then this fluid would be running like a ticker tape across all of us and recording those thoughts. And so what this interesting speculation leaves is the possibility of recording that which we think of as our minds and thoughts in the substrate of the ether. And then of course it's mixing, just like, I mean, the information is being mixed a tremendous amount, but what we've pointed out through holography here is that mixed information can be unmixed.
That makes me think of the unintentional recording of voices on pottery.
Yeah, exactly. The same sort of thing. So there is this possibility of storing everything that we are, and then furthermore, since we're now fully into speculation, fun territory, is the idea of there's a lot of different interesting psi stuff. Like now with this perspective, you read that paper and it doesn't seem so completely utterly implausible, because what I'm talking about is a deterministic method of storing information. And if what we are is the pattern and organization of information, in other words, if you think of that as a soul, because I mean, so let's break off for a moment here and talk about the what exactly is any given mind. And it is, you can take all of the parts to a car and have them in a pile, and they are not a car. You take all the parts to an engine, if they're not perfectly put together, they are not an engine. And furthermore, if the timing of the energy flowing through the through the engine is not correct, it does not work. It doesn't go. And so the idea of
You're trying
each
to say
person,
that consciousness is a process more than a thing.
right? And it is a process that is like a symphony, and that you can have multiple parts that are, and you don't still have the individual symphony. So therefore, each of us, each of our what we would think of as a soul, would be the configuration and the simultaneous, not just the information that is in our heads, but the combination, the holographic combination of all the things that are occurring around us, impinging upon that set, that crystallized set of information that's stored in our brain, and that would be the process, would be what we would think of as a soul or spirit or what have you. And then that would also then be still perhaps stored in this substrate. So basically what I've done is I've created a completely deterministic model by which you could see the idea of a soul and spirit and even continuance after death. So that was an interesting.
So that's how it relates to spirituality and consciousness.
And that's how it relates to spirituality. So
And
I mean,
how
and
it
that's
relates to your
and
book.
yeah, keep in mind, this is speculation that I find entertaining. It's not something that is, we have any kind of proof for, and so it's more for fun than for science. But there may be a point at which, if we reach a level of investigation that proves that all of these other things are true about the brain, about physics, about if all of these things are also true, then it would be something that you would want to investigate. So that's the 42. Actually, it's not 42 because you have to you have to get into a reason for existence and all of that. And that's a whole other talk.
Why not?
But that's just
book.
that's just a mechanics for everything. So that's me. I'm done.
All right, perfect. And you can get some of your technical side on steampunk physics. That in your YouTube search and smoke it. And then patreon.com/7stagesecrets for your papers, as well as secret excerpts and other things for patrons. And now we're gonna go into our patron only area and discuss things, maybe more speculation, maybe more about your book or details of some of your papers. And there's a whole lot of information in mine there.
Yeah, there's a reason why I have a paper on not a paper, an article on Graham Hancock's site.
It's also in your public post on Patreon.
Yes, because there is some interesting things about the level of knowledge about certain things that appears to come from ancient peoples also very strongly correlates with everything I've just described. So that's another interesting thing.
Maybe we'll talk more about that with our patrons in the CherrySTEM after show. So check out patreon.com/innercherry. Challenger mode, get you after show hangouts, and the more times we do this podcast, the more often we do the hangouts. So unlock them goals, become a patron. It's going to be great. And we'll talk to you guys next month.